one of the most important things that you can do with Code Interpreter to be effective, particularly if you want to be effective in getting it to reason well or to write well or whatever it is you want it to make sure that it has easy access to the knowledge that you're going to need it to reason on or use as the basis of its writing or to do whatever it is, to filter, to transform, whatever it is. Now, the easier it is for it to access that information, the more successful you're going to be in using Code Interpreter. Now, what does it mean for it to be easy to access? If you can see the information here in the conversation, you are very likely going to be successful in whatever knowledge-based task you're trying to have GPT-4 do through Code Interpreter. So let me just repeat this. If you can see the information that it's going to build off of in the conversation, you're much more likely to be successful. This is the simplest, easiest way to try to make sure that the reasoning is sound. Now, in this example with the 1040 that I did a minute ago, I had it go and extract a bunch of information, and then I had it reread and extract additional information. And part of the reason for this was I didn't see the identifiers for the questions in the conversation. And I thought that was going to be something that I wanted based on the idea that I was going to go and talk about different questions or ask about what checkboxes. Well, if I'm going to refer to checkboxes, I'm probably going to need to know the identifiers for them so I can go and reference back into the original form. Now, you don't have to do this, but it's often the easiest way to reason about what Code Interpreter is doing and getting it to do the right thing is to get it to read the information into the conversation. Now, there's other tricks that are used in the background to make this happen. Now, there's two places that the reading and rereading can happen. Now, I want to show you something interesting though, because I think this is really helpful to also show you why reading and rereading is powerful. So in the first time that I said read this, we see it pop up this box that's going and getting the information from Python, right? It's using Python to read the PDF and extract the text. And then it shows the result here. So one thing that's helpful to note here is it's actually brought everything into the conversation. Now, this is sort of a tricky thing to know, but the fact that it's read it and then it's put it in here in this result, that means it's available and in the conversation. It's possible to have access to it. Now, it may not have access to it all at once, and we may need to go and refresh it, but it's all in the conversation. Now, note what it didn't do here. When I said reread, it did not go and run Python again. Now, there's two things that could mean, and it's helpful to know this. One is the information that it needs to do this task is already present in the conversation, and so it doesn't have to write any new Python. It just goes and summarizes or reshapes or reformats information that's already been brought into the conversation. Or it is possibly hallucinating or relying on data that it was trained on, which may not be what you want. So you want to be very careful, and this is why it's helpful to think through knowing what is in the conversation and what is not. What is clearly in the context of the conversation. The easiest, simplest way to know what's there is to make sure it gets read and is visible in some way. So when you ask it to extract it, summarize it, or outline it and put it directly in here and you can see the text written out, that's just a very helpful check. And if you go, let's say for example, if you do something and you don't see it write Python code, and you just see it refactor or reformat or restructure or summarize down here, that could mean one of two things. Either that information was already present, or it's making up the information based on, now it doesn't have to be false, it just means that it isn't getting it directly from your document. So it's either getting it out of the conversation, or it's potentially, based on something it was trained on. Now, the form 1040 is something that is so common, it could have been trained on a prior year's 1040. Now, in this case, it turns out that I've uploaded the form 1040 from 2022. Now, it's possible that this version of the model was updated and based on 2022's form 1040. I don't think so. And I think what it has done is actually brought the whole form into the context of the conversation. Although we can't see it at the beginning, I think it is already there and available through the result right here. So that's really important to know, is the information there and readily present. Now, in this case, this is a great case where I just want to emphasize the importance of paying attention to what is clearly visible in the conversation, which in this case is all of this here. What is it doing in Python? Well, we see at the beginning, it's definitely reading the document in Python. So we know it went to the source document originally. Now I'm getting it to reread and bring in additional information, and it's not using Python. So either that information was already in the conversation in some way because it read the whole document and has access to it, or it's pulling it out of its own training data, its own, or it's hallucinating it in some way. And so when we begin bringing information into the conversation and working with it, when we begin asking to reread or summarize our things, we can start getting a sense of what is it really going out to the document and getting versus what's in the conversation versus what is it pulling out of what it was trained on. Now, figuring out what is coming from specifically from the conversation, the context that we see here versus what it was trained on is tricky. And there's no single straightforward way to do this. There's multiple approaches that we can use to try to solve this problem, but at different points it can be a little bit difficult. The best way that we know that it's going to our document is that we see the gray boxes and that we see it's doing something. But we don't always want it going to our gray document, because if we're having a conversation and we see that there's a direct mapping between what's above and what's below based on our task, then that's really what we want, is to get things into the conversation, particularly for reasoning tasks or writing tasks or summarization tasks. We want to get it into the conversation, summarized in some form so we can start working with it. So if you were in a situation where you're working with some document and you feel like you're struggling, that it just can't reason effectively, try to think about, how do I get that information into the conversation so that I can see it here? One, it's going to help you get a better sense of what's going on. But two, if it's in the conversation, it's much easier for it to reason on. And three, it'll also help you sort out, is it picking up something from somewhere else? Now, getting the information in the conversation doesn't have to just mean that we are going to just literally cut and paste into the conversation. There's all kinds of different ways that we can get information that it needs for reasoning into the conversation. And part of the reason I say this, if you go and look at what I did here, this is a lot of information, it's a lot of text, and it actually took a while for it to output it all. And we may not need it all. So what we want to do is we want to get the information that we need for reasoning into the conversation. And we want to be really careful that we're bringing in just what we need, because there's a limited amount of text that can go in. I talk about using a small document. And part of the reason we're using a small document is because we can get it all into one prompt, and that's easier. When we get to bigger documents, we're going to have to be selective, really selective, about what goes into the conversation and how we represent it in order to be effective. But the key is we want to get it the information it needs in order to reason and do the right thing. Now, it could be a summary, it could be an outline, it could be literally go and excerpt and read and paste verbatim into this conversation, essentially the text. There's all types of things that we could do, but one thing that we can do is we can also get a map, and we'll talk about this more later, but we can create a map of where information is within the document and put that into the conversation. We can put all kinds of other artifacts or things into the conversation that help it go and achieve its job. So in this example, I went and had it put an index of where different types of policies are covered in a document. Now, if you think about this, if I gave you a document and I said, go find this policy, and that document has an index and you can go in and look up the correct section to read, that saves you a vast amount of time, right? You have a very dense little section that gives you exactly the information you need in order to reason correctly about where to go to get the next piece of information. So you could go and look up I need to go to page 2. You then flip to page 2 and you can read just page 2, which gives you less information. Well, that exact process helps Code Interpreter or helps AI. Anytime we can give it a map of where to go find the information, it can read the mapping, which is typically much smaller than the larger volume of information, and then it can jump into the location that it needs to get the actual piece of information to load into the conversation to do the work. Now, if we look at this, we've built an index here, and then the next thing that we do is we say read the policies related to staying in an Airbnb. And notice what it does. I'm going to show this. This is code here, but hopefully you can get a sense of what this code is doing. Is it jumps, because it has the index in separate pages for each piece of information, it jumps directly to the pages it needs to read. And so it says page 4 text and page 7 text. And if you're not a Python programmer or this doesn't look familiar, just notice that it's saying page 4 and page 7 for Airbnb. And if we look at this, we got page 7, which is mileage, and we've got page 4, which is international travel, which actually I'm incorrect here. So page 4 and 7 all relate to lodging. Sorry about that. And it just shows to show you the AI sometimes gets it better than the human. I make mistakes, it makes mistakes, no judgment. So lodging is covered on pages 4 and 7. We're talking about Airbnb, which is a form of lodging. So therefore on page 4, it goes and reads it, and page 7, it goes and reads it. So the AI has done the right thing. It's used the information that we brought into the context. This document was too big to fit into a single message. So we basically brought in information into the conversation that it needed to reason effectively. And then it can use that as a jumping off point to go and find the next piece of information and bring it into the conversation. Because you see right here, the result is it now brought in those pages into the conversation in the result, and then it goes and reasons about what's inside of those pages. So when you're reasoning, when you're working with Code Interpreter, when you're that, if you can see the information here that it's going to need to reason, you are much better off. If you can't see the information that it needs to reason here in some form, then there's a good chance that Code Interpreter is going to struggle, or that Code Interpreter may hallucinate and you not realize it. So when you are working with Code Interpreter and you want it to reason about knowledge in text, try to get some form of that text into the conversation where you can see it. Or try to get some mapping, like we've done here, like an index, into the conversation so it can reason about it. Or try to get something else. If you're working with structured data, make sure it knows about and talks about the columns that you're going to be working with and brings them into the conversation. Now, it may go and rediscover and relook at the Excel file, but if from the beginning you say, explain the structure of the Excel file to me, and it lists all of the columns in that Excel file, and it already has it there, then when you go and ask it to perform a task that requires reasoning about those columns, it's going to be really easy. It's already in the conversation. It can immediately go and do it. Now, you won't always have to get the information in the conversation, but it's a really effective tool. If you can get it into the conversation, a lot of times it's going to make things much easier. So, one sort of simple mental strategy when you're working with a problem and trying to figure it out and how to solve it is it's often easier to solve the problem related to the reasoning that you're trying to get it to do or the writing that you're trying to get it to do if the information that it needs to do the reasoning or to perform or do the writing or outlining or whatever it is visible in your conversation. It looks like something that GPT-4 told you inside of Code Interpreter. And if you can't see that information, it's going to be trickier to get it right. Now, you can do it, but as a simple rule of thumb, it's going to be easier if you can get that information brought into the conversation at some point. It's not always required, but it's often a helpful tool.